We could start with each of you maybe talking a bit about your background, what led you to your current role, and why you were interested in your current role and business model. Mark, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Well, thank you. On my background, so I got my PhD in Germany, came over to the States, worked at Shell for 2 stints, quite some time, started out in the lubricant business. After leaving Shell, was president of Safety Clean, which is the largest re-refiner and used motor oil collector in the world, and then after that built up GFL's U.S. operations for what we call liquid waste, which includes everything from non-hazardous water, used motor oil, industrial services, and things like that. And then David and I knew each other for a good amount of time. We saw an opportunity to do something down in Baytown, a very exciting one. We spoke a lot about today how Texas was one of the leaders in energy. Ironically, in used motor oil, Texas did not have, even though it is one of the biggest states and one of the biggest generators of used motor oil, did not have a facility. And so we saw a great opportunity to put a facility down in Baytown, excellent location, water access, and is also, Houston is one of the biggest, probably the biggest lubricant blending hubs in the world. So it really fit in for our opportunity here to take used motor oil and turn it into very high quality new oil. So that's about it.
Perfect. Hi everyone, I'm Bree Sandlin. First off, I just wanted to thank you all for having us here today. It is really a great honor on behalf of Shell to be able to continue to support the KBH Energy Center. We're actually hosting a pretty large group of students at our Shell campus in the coming weeks. So if any of you are in the audience, we're really excited to host you, and I hope you get a chance to meet many of the brilliant scientists and engineers that are actually the work behind some of the things I get to talk about today. From a personal background for me, I hope you don't hold this against me, but I am a graduate of Texas A&M University. I got my Bachelor of Science in Economics and worked in consulting for a few years, and then went and got my MBA from the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. I did a concentration in marketing and decision models, where I found I had a true passion for marketing. Did a few years in a brand management role at Bayer, like the aspirin, or Bayer if you're German.
Yes.
And then I found that I really had this question that continually I had passion for, which was, how do we meet this increasing demand, exponentially increasing demand for energy in the world, at the same time as increasing our ability to produce it in a more sustainable, lower carbon fashion? I think it's one of the profound questions of my generation, and I was really attracted to becoming a part of the answer, which is what brought me to Shell. Getting to work in lubricants, I love it. I get to work on some amazing brands. I think it's a lot of fun, but also I get to have an impact on things. A great example is a project my team is working on right now with Penske, where we're actually working to decarbonize the sport of IndyCar racing. So we just put, which I've now learned I shouldn't be using the word renewable, but it's the best word I have at the moment, 100% renewable fuel into all IndyCars. So I think that's just an example of how we can have a lot of fun in this space, but also make an impact. So thank you again for having me.
Next.
Hi, I'm Nags. I manage Renova Resources. We are a water purification asset development company out of Orange County, California. Our expertise is treating oil field produced water for beneficial reuse purposes. Like David was explaining, we try to recover fresh water from a wastewater source generated from the oil and gas industry. It's a sustainable solution, something environmentally safe, and it also benefits the oil companies as well as the farming industry and the industrial users. From a background standpoint, I'm a civil environmental engineer born and raised in India, in Bangalore University, came for master's to US, and my resume is very short, only worked for one company, Veolia, for 25 years, and after working with them, we have come out to partner with Tailwater Capital to do more things in need with the market demand.
Thank you. Nags, while we're with you, if you could give a little more color about what's currently happening in the oil field with produced water. So typically, either in the Permian Basin or in California, without treatment solutions such as what Renovo is going to offer, what happens and what's the scale? Meaning, as status quo, how much water are we wasting by not treating it and reusing it for other uses?
Absolutely. So background is, for every barrel of oil generated, there's a lot of water generated, which you call it as produced water. In California, the ratio is 1:100. For every barrel of oil, there's 100 barrels of water is generated. Close to 2 million barrels of water is generated in California. Out in Texas, for every barrel of oil, there's 4 barrels of water generated, and about 25 million barrels per day of water is generated today in Texas. All this water currently is injected into the ground. They are disposed by deep well injection. Obviously, there's impacts to it. It affects the oil companies in regards to increasing production and the capability to, because they're limited by capacity. And it also has impacts from an environmental standpoint. What we do is we provide a solution to desalinate this water, take the salt content out of this water, so that we can make fresh water out of this oil and gas waste and use it for beneficial purposes. In California, we're trying to solve the drought problem there in the Kern County area where the farmers need this water. We're trying to connect the oil and gas industry with the farming industry out in California. In Texas, we're trying to minimize injection volumes so that they can minimize the seismicity impacts and stuff like that.
Mark, why don't you talk about the same? So in the used motor oil industry, what's currently happening if a barrel of used motor oil is not recycled? What's currently occurring and at what scale?
So in North America, we produce probably about 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion gallons of used motor oil every year. Most of it comes off automotive, industrial, trains, things like that, ships. And the two applications that really at the end of the day it could end up in is hoping that you don't landfill it, which would be a real sin. But the two historic applications, or the historic was actually burning, and then the other one is re-refining. When you look at the re-refining space, you really have, again, two options. You either take this oil, re-refine it, and turn it into a, you know, I don't want to use the word clean because Mr. Tinker will probably talk to me about that misuse of it. But we could produce a cleaner VGO with that goes into marine applications. Or preferably what we're doing is we turn it into a new oil. And so what you basically have is, envision this, you might import from somewhere in the world or take out of the Permian a gallon of oil, you refine it, and you make a base oil out of it. It actually takes a lot of oil to make a gallon of base oil. And then, you burn it at the end. But what we do is we take that oil, we clean it up, not just a little, we clean it up quite a bit, and it actually looks just like this when we're finished. You've seen what comes out of your engine, but it'll look just like this again. And is actually chemically improved over the native oil that came in. And then you can rerun that over and over again. You have a little bit of loss, and there's some energy obviously used in collecting the oil, bringing the oil to the re-refinery and processing it. And then there's just the natural losses in between. But in general, we see that you can probably get between 5 and 8 reruns of a gallon of oil until it's depleted. So think about that. You take 1 gallon of oil out of the ground and you make 8 gallons out of it without really having to take new oil out. So it's independent of where you really stand on the whole climate conversation. It's just good housekeeping. Why would you not do that if you could do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've done some studies on how much of a CO2 mitigation impact this has, and it's very significant. It's upwards of 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by recycling the lubricants instead of burning them. Bree, maybe kicking over to you. Yeah. So given Shell's global presence in all forms of energy, what drove Shell's interest in Blue Tide and recycled lubricants versus other opportunities? And then while you have the mic, maybe talk about some of the other things that you're pursuing at Shell that might be interesting to this crowd about sustainability and environmental impact.
Sure. So to start with your first question, from a Shell perspective, our strategy, which we call Powering Progress, really at the heart of that strategy is sustainability. So we've made a commitment that we want to be a net zero emissions energy company by 2050 or sooner. From a lubricants perspective, we like to be the shining star of Shell. So we want to beat that goal by 15 years. So our goal is to be net zero company, an emissions company by 2035. And the way that we think we need to do that, one of the big components is by building a more circular economy. So essentially ensuring that the materials and components that go into our products are not just used one time, right? That they're put back into the economy and used multiple times. What's interesting about, as Mark talked about, the end of life for lubricants, of all of the lubricants produced, only about a quarter today are recycled. So, as Mark talked about, what happens to the vast majority of used oil is that it's lightly cleaned and then burned. And so that produces emissions. And what we want to do is ensure the most sustainable use of that molecule that we could possibly find, which frankly is recycling. But we recognize too, as Shell, that we can't do this alone. We need partners who have real expertise in this space. And that's why our relationship and partnership with BTE was such a natural fit, right? They bring the expertise, but not only that, the output that they're able to generate is truly high quality base oils that pass all of the tests, the very stringent tests that we require to put into our products. And so we've been very impressed with the quality, which again, for us is a win-win in terms of why we really sought them out to have a relationship and a partnership. So we're very excited about the future. From a holistic Shell perspective, we do a lot of what we've talked about today in terms of recognizing there's no silver bullet to the energy transition. We're going to have to invest and be proactive in a lot of different areas of different forms of energy in order to get to the place we want to be. So there's a lot of really interesting and cool projects that are going on right now across Shell. I mean, one of them that I think is pretty fascinating is in the space of biofuels. So we're actually working to transform some of our refineries to make biofuels for aviation, for example. So how do we take used cooking oil and turn it into a biofuel? We are investing very heavily in expanding the EV charging network and infrastructure, so supporting all the electric cars we know are coming to the United States. How do we make sure that there's an infrastructure to charge those vehicles at Shell stations? But it's not just in front of the meter. We think about behind the meter, obviously, as well. So, of course, things like solar, things like wind, things like hydrogen, those are all places we're also investing and trying to find solutions for in the future. So that's kind of Shell big picture. From a lubricants perspective, where I sit, we also are looking at a lot of different projects and ways to reduce our carbon intensity. We think about things like logistics. So we move lubricants from one side of the country to the other. And we are right now piloting a logistics truck, an 18-wheeler that moves across the country that is a hybrid between hydrogen and electric. So those kinds of things, I think, are the way that we're going to find the future, is finding a lot of different spaces. We're looking at biolubricants, which right now the market for is pretty small, but I think it's going to grow. And in fact, we recently acquired the largest biolubricants company in the world, a group called Panolin. And they primarily produce out of Europe, but we're looking to produce more here in the United States and expand the use of biolubricants in many industries and sectors that we operate in. And then we're also looking at things like packaging. So how do we increase the amount of post-consumer resin in the packaging that we produce? We're also expanding our use of essentially like a bag-in-the-box type solution, which we call EcoBox, which reduces plastics considerably. So I think, again, it's not a one-shot deal. There's a lot of different ways we have to tackle this problem, and we make sure we leave no stone unturned.
Thank you, Bree.
Yeah.
So one of the things we've noticed in our portfolio when we make investments into energy transition or environmental infrastructure is that sometimes the biggest obstacles are not technology. I mean, that certainly is a big obstacle in certain circumstances, but a lot of times it's really around market adoption and how can you convince regulators and how can you convince consumers to actually want to switch over to a more sustainable, cleaner form of energy. So maybe if each of you could just comment on what are some of the biggest obstacles you've seen in your industry in terms of getting market adoption, and maybe how are those perceptions changing over the past couple of years, and what do you see going forward? Mags, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. In the water treatment sector, specifically on the oil and gas side, the technology exists, you're right. And it's proven there are facilities today which can clean up the water to a freshwater quality. The regulatory environment needs to support it a little bit more faster. To take this to another level, there's so much an oil and gas company could do. If the regulatory environments can improve the timing on the permits and everything, that will increase the delivery for the projects such like this. In the past 15 years, we have developed about 6 projects of this kind, of this massive size. What we're trying to do is a lot more of this in the industry, and what will help us a big time is the regulatory environment being more supportive of these projects.
I think from our perspective, my life here. Should I yell? From our perspective in the lubricants industry, there are a couple of things. I mentioned that what's really exciting from a technology perspective is that we see the base oils that are coming out of the refineries, like the ones that are being built by BTE, exceptional quality. They are meeting all of the standards of virgin oils and passing all the tests at the same levels, and that is truly outstanding, right? In some cases, they're even better. However, one of the big obstacles for us is that the perception in the marketplace is still a broken record from 20 years ago. And we haven't been able to catch up in terms of getting consumers and customers to believe in and feel confident in recycled base oils, the use of that. So for us, that's one of the big obstacles. I think the second one is collection of used oil, which if you think about, we own Jiffy Lube as Shell. There are 2,000 Jiffy Lubes across the country. That's a lot of locations to collect that used oil and bring it back into a recycling facility. How do we do that in an efficient manner and an easy manner? And that's just one example of an outlet. There's thousands and thousands across the country. And so getting that used oil back into a central location where we can refine it is one of the key challenges that we're working on right now.
I would say I'm going to pick up where you were and then come to his point. Quality has always been a perception in the industry, and I think it probably was justified when we look back historically, at the evolution, if you want, of used motor oil re-refining. The early plants, people ran them over a filter, I like saying, or an old sock, and then they called it, new oil. Obviously, that's come a long way when you look at that. So the early plants, the quality of the oil was generally, so we have groups in lubricants that denote their quality, like Group 1, Group 2, Group 3. We make a Group 2 plus, which is a very extremely high quality oil. But a lot of people still have in their memory these very tainted, if you want, Group 1. So that to overcome that perception was important. It was really important to get the Shells over the hump, because 5-6 years ago, I would have been pillared if I had come to a Shell facility. They would have had a lot of choice words for me. The perception over the last couple of years is markedly changed. Interestingly enough, when you look at some of the countries that were actually ahead of the curves, like Germany and Europe, the quality of the oil is actually there lower just because they were farther ahead of the curve and made more Group 1 than they made Group 2. Here in this country, the oils are generally very high. Now, coming back to what Nag was talking about, regulatory environment, that's a really important, an important factor where everyone here, I think, ultimately can play a role. Too much of the used motor oil is today still burned. And, when you look at that and you look at alternate fuels that you could be using, there's a much cleaner solution for these. So say, for example, an asphalt plant can run either on natural gas or lightly cleaned up, what we call burner or recycled fuel oil. not exactly a clean burning process. So the more of that we can push with the regulation towards re-refining, and Europe has there again, is leading. You know, there's some talk that in 2025 there'll be a requirement that at least 90+% of it gets recycled. That would be a big advancement. Ironically, when you look at it globally, some of the countries that you wouldn't think of are leading. So Chile, and most notably, actually Brazil, are probably the leaders in this area. In Brazil, you have to show as a manufacturer of oil like Shell that you are partaking to at least 40% of the new oil that you put out is getting re-refined. So you got to put your name against that. And I think, by doing things like that, you make the generator somewhat responsible, and you come up with a solution that pushes more of the oil ultimately into the re-refining.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. All these business models, recycled lubricants and oil field treated water to a discharge spec, they don't require government subsidies. These are economic business models in their own right. And yet, sometimes it's actually quite difficult for these business models, which are very environmentally positive and don't require government subsidies, to get permits. And so this is a great reason why we need centers like the KBH Center to bring everybody together from a business standpoint and a policy standpoint, so we can make sure we can make real progress today on existing energy systems. So just a great little case studies in how this has real world applications. We also see it, by the way, we have a company pursuing carbon capture. It's very difficult to get Class 6 permits in the U.S. to pursue carbon capture right now. It's a huge obstacle and something that needs to be worked out, because the U.S. has enormous potential to be a leader in the carbon capture sector here in the next couple decades. So maybe why don't we close it out with one final question? And there's a lot of debate. Mr. Tinker talked about it earlier in terms of the duration of conventional energy and maybe the application of some of these sustainability impacts that your companies are having on conventional energy. But can you talk a little bit about your projects, in the sense that these are big investments, they're fixed assets, they require many, many years to recover capital for investors. Do you guys see, in used motor oil or in oil field water, a horizon that's far enough out where investors can actually make money in this sector? And I'm listening very, very closely as your sponsor.
Do you want to start out, Nag?
Okay, absolutely.
I'll let you step in that one first.
That's right. The answer is yes, absolutely. We see a huge potential for this to grow. The number of facilities which will treat produced water for beneficial reuse, we see only an upside to that. There is an economic benefit. It's a 100% ESG compliant solution. And we are doing something environmentally safe and providing a sustainable solution to the market, which will benefit the oil company, it benefits the farming and the industries. So the need for this will allow the oil companies a license to operate, to grow the production, and it only benefits everybody. It also, in states like California, it helps to preserve precious water resources. The drought we have, even with the current rains, we are still not able to solve the drought problem because we don't have enough collection of reservoirs. That's where this kind of projects will go a long way. Projects will happen. It's the time frame in regards to regulatory environment, but the size of these projects are going to be massive. We are looking at facilities which are like 500,000 barrel per day plants, both in Texas as well as in California. These will be consolidated, centralized treatment facilities which will generate fresh water for these applications. So from an investor standpoint, I see that what the market was lacking was companies to come together instead of doing individually pieces of this technology and pieces of services, one solution provider with capital investment and everything, and that's what I think will differentiate us in the market.
When I look at it, there is a lot of hype, and as Dr. Tinker showed, oil and gas is still here for quite some time.
That's right.
So is the lubricant business going away? We don't believe that. When we look at fact at all the global projections, just because, again, what he was talking about, we look at Southeast Asia, we look at India, There's tremendous opportunity, and it has to grow there because, I mean, anyone who's like myself has been there and has seen the poverty of the people. We have to be not arrogant about that and expect that they want to achieve similar life or quality of life as we have. And so I think, globally, it is going to continue to grow. Are there going to be regions that are going to see some take back? For sure. But you got to temper that with just, again, looking at the industry as a whole. The industry consists of passenger car, heavy duty, things like railroad, and then, just agricultural and other applications. A lot of those will continue to grow. We've seen the truck business keep on going. And as he again showed, there's no simple solution for getting rid of internal combustion engines and railroads and trucks. At the end of the day, even if it starts decreasing, the need to use the very valuable resource of virgin oil and to turn that into a lubricant will diminish. And I think when there's the last plant that goes out of, it'll be BTE Baytown. So, because just very simple fact, we will shift more and more, and we have seen that with our partner. There's the major oil companies will be shifting more and more as they can, just like Shell just said, to a carbon neutral or carbon, not neutral, but a reduced carbon footprint. And going back to David, if you can cut it, or how do you cut 85% of your energy out of a gallon of oil? Well, there's a couple components that go in there. New oil, and then about 10 to 15% of additives. The additives are polymeric, mostly in nature, the petrochemicals. You really can't make them any other way. And so the 85% is where you have to attack it. And I think we see there that there's for a long time still a home. Today, less than 50% of the U.S.'s or North America's oil is actually re-refined, so we have a long runway.
I think Mark said it exactly right from my perspective. If you think about, again, the sectors that we operate in, while we might see electric vehicles from a consumer perspective increase at a faster rate, they still require lubricants to operate. It's not motor oil, but there's still coolants and greases, et cetera, that help the vehicle operate. And then in addition to that, I think it's going to be much, much slower that we see the other sectors start to decarbonize. Trucking industry and on highway, it's going to take a while. It really is. We have to find various solutions. Electric might be part of the answer, but not the complete answer. And so I think the internal combustion engine, to Mark's point, it's not going away anytime soon. And then I think the industrial and off-highway sectors are even more extreme. It's going to take a long time for us to get to a point where general manufacturing, agriculture equipment, mining equipment, rail equipment moves to any form that's not combustible. So at this point, there's not real solutions. We're going to have to keep the world progressing, so lubricants are going to be a part of it for the foreseeable future.
Well said.